Yeah, we have about 10 more people registered. Usually I give it to like 7:02-ish, a couple minutes after.
Okay.
Then we're good to go. People usually trickle in
Okay.
a little later, but yeah, we are live on Facebook. So everybody over in Facebook land, hello, hello. I'll be monitoring that throughout the night. So if you have any questions there, please feel free to ask. I see a couple more people have joined us. While we're waiting, read anything good during the whole pandemic shutdown? Any good books your way?
Who, me?
You, yeah.
Oh, well, actually, I'm in the process of writing a couple of books.
Really?
Yes. So I'm writing, co-authoring one with a gentleman from Massachusetts on the Massachusetts Humane Society and pre-Civil War rescue here in the States.
Mm-hmm.
I've got one I'm writing on prohibition, Coast Guard prohibition and enforcement.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then one that will be on, there are a lot of books on lighthouses. There aren't a lot of books that talk about even bigger job that they had of the different kinds of buoys, the history of how, the technical history of how those buoys came to be, and then how they service buoys and stuff. It's going to be a kind of a niche book, as you can imagine. So.
Hey, that's okay though. That's okay. That's the kind of book I like. So be looking forward to that one. So, all right, everybody. Well, I think we'll get started here. Usually I take a couple minutes and we'll go over some of the ground rules. So that's what we'll start as people start to trickle in. But for the most part, be respectful in the chat. That's one of the first things we ask. We have to say it, to your fellow guests, moderator, me, the presenter. This is being recorded. I will go ahead and actually do that now. Looks like we are recording. It's being recorded, but don't fret. Really, the only people on the screen are the ones that you'll see, the presenter and myself. Our beautiful faces will be the ones that are being saved. Your camera and microphone are disabled automatically. We are streaming live to Facebook as well as it's being recorded. We will upload this to YouTube and Facebook, so you may watch later. So if you have to run, don't worry, don't fret. You'll be able to actually watch. And with that, if you have any questions that if you do have to run, if you have any questions, I'm going to be putting my email in the chat. So fire some away, later on if you have to take off. Questions are going to be taken. We have a block allotted 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you do have a question, use the Q&A function and we'll get that answered. If it is like an acronym or something that you need answered right away, I'll try to interject or I'll even comment in the comments myself below. But yeah, if you do have questions, fire away. Please ask. That's what we're here for. So welcome to another edition of the Erie Maritime Museum's lecture circuit. This evening, we're kicking off somewhat of a new subset of our lecture series where we're going to be highlighting a major aspect of our coastal history. Erie Maritime Museum is a community gathering place where we welcome audiences of all abilities and backgrounds to encounter and experience the maritime history and heritage of the greater Erie region, including civilian activity and innovation, military service, and Pennsylvania's contributions to the maritime industry and stewardship of the Great Lakes. So with that, this topic tonight really fits perfectly into what we're trying to do and our mission. And it's really, tonight's topic is really a deep human story. It epitomizes and drives home our mission pretty well. So my name is Chuck Johnson. I am the museum educator here at the Erie Maritime Museum. And as I said, tonight is one of our newest series discussing the history of the U.S. Life-Saving Service, the ancestor to the U.S. Coast Guard. And tonight's topic itself is really an introduction to that service as a whole. Following this, we have two more currently scheduled. Saturday, the 27th of March, 2 p.m., we're going to be going into the history of Erie, really the Presque Isle Station. Registration for that I'm going to add into the chat as well. And lastly, for part 3, we're going to, as Tim actually alluded to, we're going to be talking about Coast Guard operations during Prohibition. That's on March 31st at 7 p.m. Each of those programs are going to be presented by tonight's guest, Tim Dring. Commander Dring retired from the U.S. Naval Reserve after 27 years of active and reserve duty, service aboard destroyers and frigates, as well as reserve duty in several different assignments, including composite Navy, Coast Guard, coastal warfare, harbor defense units on the East Coast, and the Atlantic Fleet Carrier Battle Group Staff Augmentation Unit. He's actually written a book with William Wilkinson. Is that correct, Tim?
Yes.
Book published in 2009, University Press of Florida, about American coastal rescue craft, on the technical design history of those craft as well. So without further ado, I'm going to allow Tim to kick things off, share his screen, and tell this story. So Tim, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Chuck, for inviting me to give this presentation. We're going to start off with sort of an intro level review of the history of the life-saving service and the early Coast Guard. And this is probably one of the busiest of the three that I'm giving. This is probably going to be the busiest one. So as Chuck mentioned, if you could pop, that will let me get through the presentation. And then I'll be happy to stay and answer any questions you have. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And okay. Can everyone see that? Yep. Okay. All right. So, really, so if you look at today's Coast Guard and its origins, there are three primary components to what the Coast Guard does for the United States and its citizens. One has to do with providing reliable aids to navigation for mariners to use to fix the position of their vessel safely. The other one has to do with policing for smuggling, and as an extension to that, being an additional military service to the United States. But the third part, which is what the focus is going to be this evening, is on rescuing survivors of shipwrecks or other maritime accidents. And we're going to start off with talking about how the situation was prior to the Civil War, and then what happened after the Civil War that led to the creation of what was the U.S. Life-Saving Service, which was one of the predecessor agencies for the U.S. Coast Guard. All these missions that I have outlined here continue in today's Coast Guard to varying degrees, and so and they're important missions that benefit the American public directly. What you have to do is sort of take a mental journey with me back in time to the way things were in the maritime field back in the early 1800s, particularly after the War of 1812, when after we gained our independence in the Revolutionary War, but then reaffirmed that independence after the War of 1812. There was a tremendous increase in maritime vessel traffic to and from the United States. A lot of it consisting of immigrants trying to make their way to the New World, to start a new life. But a lot of it was also cargo that was coming into the country, going out, and also along the coast, what we call coastwise commerce. The other thing about the early 1800s was, unfortunately, in the United States, compared to some of the European countries, our aids to navigation system here, in terms of lighthouses, buoys, well-marked and well-maintained channels, was very poor. And you combine that with the crude navigation methods that were available at the time, that led to a lot of inaccurate navigation for a lot of these vessels. And you're talking about vessels that relied primarily on the wind for propulsion. This is really, prior to the Civil War, most merchant vessels were sail-driven, wind-driven, not steam-driven or motor-driven. So the other important thing to remember is that back in those early 1800s, there were no federal requirements for safety inspections, for carrying safety equipment aboard the ships, including life jackets and lifeboats. Other than what the maritime insurance industry might require in terms of getting insurance coverage, basically a ship's captain and its owner could outfit a ship in whatever way equipped or maximally equipped. Also, the only part of the United States that had what you would consider to be an organized rescue service for shipwreck victims was in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Humane Society, which still continues today, although its focus now is on saving animals. But back in the day, its primary focus was human beings from drowning, from death by drowning, particularly shipwreck victims. So after the War of 1812, with the increase in merchant vessel traffic, there were a lot of accidents that also occurred. After the War of 1812, the primary port of entry for the United States really it had become New York, and the reason for that is because New York, the city and the harbor there, had good connections to the interior portions of the country by means of the Hudson River, combined with the Erie Canal, along with some other canals. And eventually, starting in the 1830s, railroad service and so forth. So New York became a primary port of entry for both immigrants coming into the country, passengers on business trips, but also cargo. And so if you look at a chart of the entrance to New York, it serves like it looks like a funnel with the Long Island beaches on the north side, and on the south side, the New Jersey beaches. Both those beach areas have extensive sandbars offshore that can go up to several miles. And if a ship's not careful, they can run aground on those sandbars very quickly and easily. So, and that's in fact what was happening. You see a few accidents listed here: the Bristol, the Mexico, the John Minturn, and the number of deaths associated with them. And a lot of those deaths had to do with the fact earlier that they were carrying. People did not really know how to swim back in those days, including some of the crewmen themselves. You would think a professional sailor would want to learn how to swim, but believe it or not, that wasn't really the case until much later in the 1800s. And to this day, there are still mass grave sites, both on Long Island and in New Jersey, where these bodies that washed ashore are buried because they weren't able to identify them, which is quite a reminder of the hazards of sea duty. A prominent physician that lived in Monmouth County, New Jersey, next county over from where I live here in New Jersey, and he happened to witness one of these shipwrecks. It wasn't one of the bigger ones; it was the Tarasto. But what happened in the Tarasto was similar to the others.
Hey Tim.
In that, yeah.
Sorry to bother you. Could you actually turn off your camera? We're getting some bandwidth issues with your audio. Okay. That usually helps.
All right, let me hang on here. All right, so turn off the camera. Yeah, just turn off the camera. It'll allow the audio to come through a little bit more smooth. Usually that works. All right, let me. Should be down at the bottom left-hand side of Zoom. It'll say start video. Let me get back to Zoom here. Okay, now my incompetence is coming into play here with technology. Here, let me see if I could do it. Let me look into it real quick. Okay, I think I got it. Okay, all right, so okay. I can go back to the presentation? Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Mm-hmm. Let me maximize this again. Okay, so he witnessed one of these shipwrecks, the Tarasto, and all the crew and passengers on board the Tarasto drowned within sight of the beach. There were witnesses, but they had no equipment, no training, no nothing to try to rescue these people in the storm surf. And that made a deep impression on Newell. And it was a little bit later, in the mid 1840s, that he was elected to Congress to represent Monmouth County. And he was successful in the summer of 1848 in getting a supplemental rider on the annual appropriation for lighthouses. The rider was for an additional $10,000 to have 8 unmanned volunteer rescue boathouses constructed on the northern portion of the coast of New Jersey. And the first one of those was completed at the beginning of 1849, Spermaceti Cove, which interestingly still survives. You can consider it to be the first Coast Guard station in the United States. It looks like a garage, but that was the first boathouse, and it now resides on the back side of the property of the Twin Lighthouse up at Highlands, New Jersey. That was really the impetus to what expanded into a larger program of rescue boathouse construction for the entire coastline of New Jersey, as well as that of Long Island and a few other sites. In addition, starting in 1850s, Congress was willing to appropriate money for the purchase of surf boats to be stationed at other locations in the United States where they felt that there was a hazard. And a number of those sites were on the Great Lakes. This is a period photograph of one of these boathouses I've encountered in the years I've been studying this. This one was at Long Branch, New Jersey. The building no longer exists, but this is what the Spermaceti Cove building looks like. That's at the Twin Lighthouse. And you can see a life car here that the man is touching. And then the man with the telescope is a Manbi Mortar with the mortar shot. And then there's a surf boat inside on a wagon, along with ropes and other equipment and so forth. This image was dated from 1868, so it's a little bit later. This is the surf boat over here in the upper right corner. That's a Francis iron-hulled cord. This was constructed of sheets of corrugated iron, hydraulically pressed into ridged patterns like you see there, and then riveted together to form the surf boat. Pretty interesting technology for the time. It was the technology was really developed by Joseph Francis of New York, and the place where these boats were built was the same place where the Union Monitor, the USS Monitor, was constructed during the Civil War, Novelty Ironworks in Brooklyn, New York. The photo in the middle that you see is a later Coast Guardsman standing next to a Manbi mortar. These were the mortars that were supplied to the boathouses, and they were used to shoot rope out to the shipwreck using those little cannonballs that you see there. And then all the way to the left, in the upper left corner, is a Francis metallic life car. And the concept there was that you cram as many people inside that life car and then close the hatch and pull the life car ashore to the beach from the shipwreck. One of the original models is also at the Twin Lights. And it's a pretty scary thing when you look inside there and see how little room able to cram between 4 and 6 people inside that thing before the hatch was closed to be pulled to the beach. Well, fortunately, this system was demonstrated to be successful, and the first one was the Airshire Wreck of 1850 on the New Jersey coast, down around the area just below Point Pleasant Beach. And they had just finished building one of the rescue houses there. And believe it or not, the man who lived nearby, who was the custodian of that boathouse, John Maxon, was a very experienced boatman. And these were men who were hired by the maritime insurance companies to try to salvage as much of a shipwrecked cargo as they could to keep the monetary losses down. They would also rescue people if they could, but they were very experienced, very highly trained individuals. And John Maxon happened to be there. He took charge of the volunteers, and they successfully rescued 201 people just using that life car. As you can imagine, that was a lot of multiple trips had to be made back and forth from the beach to the shipwreck and back in order to get all those people out. There were other rescues that were successful using the same equipment, both in New Jersey and Long Island, and those are listed below. And again, you can see that were saved, and that usually indicates those shipwrecks with that number of people. It usually indicates that those shipwrecks were ships that were carrying immigrants to the states, and that was the whole idea, is to keep the human loss down as much as possible, or even eliminate it. This is an artist's depiction of the Airshire Wreck rescue, and you can see the life car suspended between the beach there and the shipwreck. The artist took a little bit of liberty, geographically speaking, because the Barnegat Lighthouse that you see to the right in the background, that was nowhere to be seen where this wreck actually occurred, nor were there any rocks nearby, because that stretch of New Jersey beach is nothing but sand and sand dunes. So, but it illustrates pretty well how this would have looked actually in use. Well, along with some successes, though, were a lot of failures. And the two most notorious failures, again, along the Jersey coast, were the Powhatan and New Era, not long after the system came into existence. These wrecks both occurred in 1854, and nearly all the people on both of these vessels were lost, mostly because of the incompetence of the volunteers and their inability to successfully and properly use the equipment that was provided by the federal government. A total of 583 people, and there are two massive grave sites for the Powhatan and New Era victims in Jersey, and I've visited both of them, and it's pretty emotional. So this was the state of U.S. rescue, along with, as I mentioned, the Massachusetts Humane Society, up until the beginning of the Civil War. And as you can imagine, during the Civil War, with the focus on the war effort itself, the support from the federal government for these boathouses deteriorated to nothing, and the condition of the boathouses and their equipment deteriorated horribly. And so that set up the whole situation for additional failure once the Civil War was over after 1865 and maritime commerce picked up again. Okay, there we go. Oh, wait, hang on. Okay, so it was because of additional losses of life that Congress agreed to spend more money, basically, to create a new system. And rather than being volunteer manned, it would be manned by actual trained professional surfmen, supervised by a trained professional keeper. And these individuals would be paid, they'd be paid a salary. It was intended to be a seasonal operation during the primary times of the year when most of these shipwrecks were occurring, which on the East Coast here where I live is usually months. So, and these would be subject to supervision and inspection by a district superintendent, and then overseen by a general superintendent with the assistance of certain designated officers from the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service. The initial system that was created in 1871 by congressional legislation was changed in 1878 to make this service a totally independent agency under the Treasury Department, and that's really the birth of the U.S. Life-Saving Service. And a gentleman by the name of Sumner Kimball was made its general superintendent. He was an attorney from Maine, and prior to this, he had an excellent reputation for honesty and dedication to his work there within the Treasury Department. And even though he was not a professional mariner, he was a very, very good manager and organizer. And he was critical in the years and months to come in getting the service up and running. So it was in this growth period of the U.S. Life-Saving Service from the late 1870s well into the 1880s and early 1890s that it grew into a countrywide system and service, including the Great Lakes, and ultimately wound up with a total of 13 districts And within those districts, a total of 394 stations. So this is how the organization looked. You had the general superintendent, which associated him was a chief inspector who was a commissioned revenue cutter service officer. They had a couple of different advisory boards that were made up of individuals who, experts in the field, who would advise on various matters of operation and equipment and so forth. And then each district would have a district superintendent with a district inspector, and then you'd have a whole bunch of individual stations that were under the care of a surfman crew. This just gives you an example of one district. This is the 4th district where I live. New Jersey, believe it or not, despite the fact that we're one of the smallest states in the United States, we wound up having the largest number of stations in the service's history, a total of 42 stations just within our district, running from Sandy Hook, which is right at the southern part of the entrance to New York Harbor, all the way down to the tip of Cape May, right at the entrance to Delaware Bay. The idea was to have them being able to assist each other. So they were spaced apart roughly between 4 to 5, maybe 6 miles apart. So that way, if one station needed help in responding to a wreck, the next adjacent station up or down the line could come to help them. So that was the idea in having so many stations like this. Long Island's shore was very similar. They didn't have 42 stations. They had, I believe, 35 stations, and they were the next most dense area of station coverage in the United States. This is Sumner Kimball on the left here. That's what he looked like. And then you see him seated in the center here in this group photo. Oliver Maxim is at his right, our left. Maxim was a long-term employee of the Life-Saving Service well into the early Coast Guard years. And the other gentleman there in this photo, it's not a complete showing, but a pretty good showing of the district superintendents that were there for a meeting with Sumner Kimball. This is a typical photograph, group photo of one of the stations. This happens to be one of the most famous stations, Point Allerton, outside of Boston Harbor, with one of the most famous keepers in the service's history, Joshua James, and with his surfman crew. He's in his winter uniform. They are in their summer uniform, but you can see arrayed around them some of the equipment that they use, and we'll talk about some of this equipment here shortly. But I just gave you this group photo just to see kind of what a typical station crew looked like. So along with the boathouses by themselves weren't going to work anymore because they needed to have dormitory facilities for the crewmen. So the stations, they had to embark on a major construction program for the stations. And there were a wide variety of architectural styles in these stations, depending upon where the station was being built, the area that it was covering, and what capabilities the station needed to have. So, but they were all similar in that they were pretty bare bones in terms of design, with very, very few creature comforts. So we're talking about no indoor plumbing, no centralized heating or air conditioning. Well into the World War I period, no electrical lighting. But interestingly, nearly all these stations very soon after the Civil War were all equipped with a telephone, with the reason being that they had to be able to report a wreck to the next station up or down the line, as well as to the district office. Those stations that were in an inlet would usually have a ramp with a marine railway, and that was the case for many of the stations on the Great Lakes because of just the way the Great Lakes are compared to the beaches here on the East Coast or the rocky coastline that you have in the Pacific Ocean. So this just gives you a few examples. So starting with the upper left corner, this was the last pure boathouse, no dormitory facilities that had been built in the 1850s. prior to the life-saving service. This one was located down on the Jersey coast down by Cape May. Then you had the next one below it is what was called the Red House style, which was the first real simple, very, very simple 1871 era design, which incorporated dormitory facilities for the crew upstairs, a very small kitchen and dining area in the back part. And then the vast bulk of the station was the boat room and equipment storage here on the ground floor. And you see the surf boat here on its wagon outside. The photos here in the middle, that's the Erie Station when it was first built. That was an 1875 style building. Again, you can tell very bare bones. You see the lookout position on the roof. I'll talk more about this building in the next segment of my presentation when we talk specifically about Station Erie. And then over to the right is a more sophisticated design of Duluth style station with a double boat room arrangement and much roomier quarters for the crew, for the keeper, and then an integral lookout tower built with the station. But there are other varieties as well. So an architect by the name of Paul Peltz, who designed the Library of Congress, amongst other buildings, designed 4 stations to this architectural design that you see to the far left. This particular one here is the Deal Station in New Jersey. The similar ones were in Bay Head, Atlantic City, and then up in Newport, Rhode Island, the Brenton Cove or Brenton Point station was the same design. Much more, much fancier looking building, again, with the lookout tower and such. But again, no indoor plumbing, no centralized heating of any kind. The one in the middle is the Jersey Pattern Station, and then the one all the way to the right is a unique station that was built at Narragansett Pier in Rhode Island, and it was all stone and very, very rugged station building because it was one of the few buildings in that town that survived the famous 1938 hurricane. These just give you some examples of stations in the Great Lakes area. You have Marblehead all the way to the left with its ramp and lifeboat and surf boat. You have Oswego in the middle on Lake Ontario, and then you have Charlevoix here on the right. And again, with its ramp and lifeboat and surf boat. In terms of the personnel, so station keepers were very carefully selected. Usually it was a recommendation by a district superintendent in terms of who he would nominate whoever they thought was capable to be a station keeper, and then Sumner Kimball would approve it. And they served year round. So even though the station might be a seasonal station, the keepers were there all year round in order to maintain the equipment and make sure everything was in working order for when the season started again. The surfmen were recruited by the keeper himself. It did not require approval by the district superintendent. But the idea with the surfmen was that they had to be capable boatmen, very experienced with the local area, and reliable men. Oh, I forgot to mention the last bullet on this slide. So one of the problems at a shipwreck is if the insurance people don't get there fast enough, or the local sheriff or whatever, whatever surviving things are on the ship tend to start disappearing. They sprout legs and walk away. And so that was a very, very active pastime for a lot of people that resided near or on the coast. And so part of the idea was that the keeper of each of these life-saving stations would have the legal authorization to protect that cargo from looting. So the station keeper was officially designated as a U.S. Assistant Customs Inspector, and then the surfmen were deputized as Assistant Custom Inspectors so that they could actually stand duty at the wreck. It's called wreck duty, and protect anything from being looted. We talked about surfmen. So the senior-most surfman was always the #1 surfman, and then the numbers went down in decreasing levels of seniority, experience, competency, so forth. So usually the number 6 or 7 surfman, the junior-most surfman, was usually one of the youngest guys, least experienced guys, and then as he got more experience, he would get promoted up over subsequent seasons and eventually try to aspire to either being #1 or even the keeper himself. The total number on where the station was, what their area of operation was, what kind of equipment they had, and their area of coverage. Most stations tended to have 6 surfmen plus the keeper, and then during the worst of the winter season, they would hire what was called the winter man, #7 surfman, as an extra hand. And he was usually only on duty for a few months and then went off duty, whereas the remaining surfman, the 6 surfman, would stay on during the entire season of station operation. And then if a surfman had to step out because of illness or a temporary disability, he was replaced by a temporary or substitute surfman. Now, back in this day, there was no disability pay, there was no retirement pay, there were no medical facilities for these gentlemen. Everything was out of their own pocket. The only thing they could do is get treatment at a U.S. Public Health Service hospital if one was available nearby. So what was different, with the Kimball and his advisors were absolutely determined that this was going to be a different sort of service compared to the volunteer era. And a lot of that had to do with the training and retraining of the crews so that they were absolutely proficient in all their duties. So they had a regular weekly schedule of very specific drills they had to perform repeatedly over many weeks and months and so forth, so that they had to learn, they had to be able to show proficiency in operating their boats. They had to show proficiency in terms of rigging any of the equipment from the beach out to the shipwreck, like the Breeches Buoy or a life car, which we'll talk about shortly. Proficient in signaling to and from ships at sea, as well as, believe it or not, first aid and treatment of injuries, as well as people who appear to have drowned but might be resuscitated. So they were regularly inspected, usually on a quarterly basis. Sometimes if a station was not quite totally proficient, the inspector would show up more often than quarterly, and they were actually graded on their performance. And keepers that were not shown to be staying on top of their crews to remain proficient could be dismissed from the service, as well as any of the surfmen, by this inspector. Starting in the early 1890s, the keeper and the crew were required to have a standard uniform, both a wintertime uniform and a summer uniform. Up to that point, if you look at photos of station crews from the 1880s and earlier, you see a lot of variety in terms of their attire. But starting in the early 1890s, this was all standardized. And this is what it looked like. So you had over on the left, you have their summer dress in whites. The keeper here who's seated is in his, basically his year-round blues, but they were really, it was really a winter uniform. Then you have the surfman here in the middle is in his winter dress, and you can see the life-saving service patch on one sleeve of his coat. On the other sleeve would be the number that for his surfing position, number 1 through 6 or 7, so forth. And then you would have their foul weather gear, which is what's shown here on the right. These are your classic old oilskins, usually linseed oil impregnated or rubberized canvas material with their sou'wester hats on, and nothing like the foul weather gear we have today, for sure. The terms of the equipment, there was a bit of variability depending upon the local operating conditions. Generally speaking, the station's boat equipment was one of 2 types. They either had a very seaworthy capable lifeboat, which by definition was always a self-bailing, self-righting boat, or they had a surf boat, none of which were self-righting, and only one model, only one type was self-bailing. There were a lot of different names for the various models and so forth. In terms of the lifeboats, though, they trace all their lineage to a prototype that was purchased from the Royal National Lifeboat Institution in Great Britain in 1873. And this boat still exists storage right now, but it's at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, and it's still Coast Guard property. Hopefully it'll be put back on display here at sometime in the future. But that's the great service used. Surf boats were more of a local thing. There were a lot of different types based on where in the United States they were. In New England, they preferred what were called double enders, where the bow and the stern were both pointy. Okay, whereas here in Jersey, we preferred single enders, where the bow was pointy, but the stern was squared off. Okay, that was the Jersey Squan Long Branch that you see there. Whereas the Monomoy, Race Point, BB type, and so forth, they were the double enders. And the whole idea was that the surf boats could be launched directly from a wagon into the surf at the site of the wreck, whereas a lifeboat had to be launched back at the station and then rowed to the site of the wreck or sailed to the site of the wreck. So the one that was most often used, primarily on the Great Lakes, but also at a few locations on both the east and west coast, was the 26 self-righting, self-bailing. And then the Dobbins, which was primarily a Great Lakes lifeboat, although some of them were used out in the Pacific Northwest for some very obscure technical reasons. And then here's Jersey type squared off surf boat looked like. And then the BB McClellan was probably the classic model double ender, pointy on both ends. And this was the only one that was self-bailing. Here's photos of Monomoy surf boats, but this illustrates to you they were transported to the site. So the Congress initially was very miserly in terms of appropriating money to the service. Was to be transported and would not provide money for a horse. So unless the keeper or one of the surfmen had a personal, a privately owned horse that they made available to the station, generally speaking, the surfmen had to pull the equipment themselves. So that's the example that you see here to the left. That's a lot of weight because the boat alone weighs about 1,000 pounds empty. And then if you add the equipment, you're talking 1,200 to 1,300 pounds. And then the weight of the wagon that they're pulling is about another 1,300 pounds. So altogether, you're talking about well over a ton of weight that they're having to pull over sand dunes from the station to the wreck site, which could be a couple miles away from the station, and then back again to the station once they're finished with it. So a lot of hard work. Whereas here you see to the right, you see a boat on the wagon with a horse. So much better arrangement for them. And it was finally later in the 1880s that Congress started appropriating money for a barn or a stable, as well as feed for the horse and vet bills to care for the horse. And that continued well into the Coast Guard years after World War I. Launching a surf boat can be a pretty hazardous business. I mean, you see them getting ready to launch here on the left and the middle here. The last person to board the boat is the coxswain. He has to, once the boat is waterborne, he has to hop over the stern of the boat to pick up the steering oar. You just hope that he completes that leap into the boat without hanging himself up there on the gunwale of the boat. But the photo all the way to the right is Plum Island in Massachusetts, and you see that's a lot rougher, and they're about ready to get hit. The coxswain's just about over into the boat, and you see a breaker coming right in on them. And that was more the typical case when they were launching these boats in an actual wreck to actually conduct a rescue. This is some of the other equipment they had. So they had a beach cart, which carried all the equipment needed to rig either a breeches buoy or the life car. You see the beach cart here on the photo on the left with its various ropes and equipment and so forth. You see a Manbi mortar here at the bottom, and then what's called a Lyle gun, which was an improved means of shooting a line out to a shipwreck compared to the Manbi mortar. The Lyle gun came about in 1876. It was developed by David Lyle of the U.S. Artillery, and it was a really, really good gun, very accurate, capable of shooting out to 900 yards rough charge of black powder, but usually usually they preferred to keep it out to like within 400 yards or so of the beach because of the difficulty in handling lines once you get that far offshore. The life car you see in a cradle behind the beach cart. Again, this is a slightly modified model. It looks like an egg, but same concept where it has a hatch and you climb into that thing, the hatch gets closed, and then you get pulled ashore from the shipwreck onto the beach. This shows the crew getting ready to pull their beach cart to a drill. This photo was taken at Sandy Hook, New Jersey. But this is the typical situation. And you can see them wearing their winter garb here, their winter blues. The breeches buoy was used probably more often than any other means of rescuing people from a shipwreck once it was perfected. So basically the photo or the illustration on the right shows you what it looks like when it's totally assembled. You have the wreck offshore on the sandbar. You have what's called the crotch, which supports the whole rig off of the water, off of the beach. And then you have a main hawser on which is hung the breeches buoy. And then the buoy is pulled back and forth by whip lines. The crew on the ship, all they have to do is basically tie off the hawser and tie off a pulley there, and everything else is pulled by the guys here on the beach. And this is what it looks like in actual use. This was a wreck up in Cape Cod, and they're bringing a person ashore from a schooner wreck. This just illustrates the setup. They regularly drilled and trained with setting this up because you have to realize a lot of these wrecks occurred at night during stormy weather. And so they had to be able to do this under any conditions of weather and temperature. And each man had to know their job cold. And so, and the other thing was, because we're talking a wooden hulled ship banging up against a sandbar in stormy sea conditions, that ship could break up at any time. So time was of the essence in rigging this to bring survivors ashore. So the goal was always to try to have this rigged and the first person being brought ashore within 3 to 5 minutes of them arriving on scene. So once the 1800s are ending and you're getting into the early 1900s, the big technology change was the availability of reliable marine grade internal combustion engines. And so the life-saving service, particularly compared to a lot of the European lifeboat services, was very quick to adopt internal combustion engines for their rescue boats, both for the surf boat that you see here on the right, the B.B. McClellan motor surf boat, and the lifeboat. In this case, a 36-foot designed from the start motor lifeboat. But you can still see it carries sails, and it was also outfitted for. We're talking about a total boat weight of about 12 tons with this 36-footer. So I can't imagine how they would successfully, in any kind of heavy seas, row a 12-ton boat to and from the station out to a shipwreck. So this is what they look like. The McClellan 36-footer on the left, the B.B. McClellan 25-footer on the right. Just to give you a point of reference, the B.B. McClellan motor surf boat was equipped with a 12 horsepower gasoline engine. Now, my lawn tractor has a 17 horsepower gasoline engine in it. So we're not talking about a high-powered boat with a lot of oomph behind it, but it was state of the art for the time, and it was a huge improvement over these guys having to row or sail the boat out to the wreck scene. The lifeboat, by contrast, had a 25 horsepower engine. Again, we're not talking about a lot of power. So at this point, we're talking about evolutionary, not revolutionary changes in technology, but they significantly improved the rescue capabilities of the service such that they could actually start considering closing down stations that were no longer necessary. And that's in fact what happened, particularly after World War I, with going over to motorized equipment, and also a decrease in those big catastrophic shipwrecks that occurred back in the earlier 1800s. The life-saving service was able to start closing stations that were no longer needed. And that was what was going on here. But interesting, Breeches Buoy continued in use well into the 1960s, until helicopters really increased their capability to be able to stay in a hover over a shipwreck in under storm wind conditions. So, and it was 1948 that the Coast Guard finally lifted the requirement for stations to be trained in rowing a surf boat through surf. These are just this is just a quick list of some of the rescues up to through the early World War I period and such. Quite a few people were saved. I have a slide here in a minute that shows you total numbers. The thing about the changeover to the Coast Guard, the difficult transition, because the life-saving service was a civilian agency within the Treasury Department, whereas the revenue cutter system, revenue cutter service was a military organization within the Treasury Department. And so a lot of surfmen and keepers didn't like the idea of becoming militarized. So you had a lot of retirements when the Coast Guard was formed in 1915. And for many years thereafter, there were always differences between the Coast Guardsmen that came from the legacy of the lifeboat stations versus the Coast Guardsmen that came from the legacy of. So, but there were improvements and efficiencies realized in terms of management, cost, and everything else. This gives you some overall statistics. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard, believe it or not, hasn't been very good about keeping numbers for the entire period of the service's existence, but at least through the start of the life-saving service in 1871 through the time up until the time that it became part of the Coast Guard, this just gives you total numbers. Pretty impressive. The other number, though, that I want to point out is how many died in the line of duty, 329. So this glorious service that they provided came at a cost, a human cost. And as you'll hear me talk about my next presentation, when I talk about Station Erie had its share of human loss as well, which I will cover the next session. Interestingly, even though there was a decrease in the number of large shipwrecks, there was an corresponding increase in the number of recreational boat accidents. So today, I would say, basically since World War II, the vast majority of the search and rescue cases that the Coast Guard responds to are associated with recreational boats rather than commercial vessels. It's a very weird situation, but I mean, it's still a reason for their existence. So that this, in parallel with the life-saving service creation and operation, you have a lot of other improvements that take place that cause an improvement in maritime safety. So you had improvements in the aids to navigation. You have improvements in navigational methods, particularly once radio is available. You also have improvements in the rescue craft themselves. The experience and competency of the mariners themselves improves. The safety equipment on board the vessels improves and becomes inspectionable. But you still have some pretty spectacular rescue cases, and one of the ones that is quite popularly known, excuse me, is the Pendleton Rescue of 1952, which was a oil tanker that split in two off of Cape Cod during a very bad storm. Winter, the greatest small boat rescues in Coast Guard history, based on the number of people saved and the conditions of the rescue. But one thing that still hasn't changed is, and I when I give this presentation to the men and women at our actual Coast Guard stations, I'm always impressed by their professionalism and their dedication to their job. None of that has changed, going all the way back to when the life-saving service surfmen had the same attitudes of dedication to their work and determination to save as many lives as possible. And I'll just close with just a couple of, since I'm a boat guy, this just shows you the lineage of some of the lifeboats, motor lifeboats, how they've changed over the years from the non-motorized pulling type to what we use today, the 47 footers, and then what I call utility craft, and then the surf boats. And that's just kind of a rogues gallery of the different boats. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Such a, for me, it's such an exciting topic because, like I said, I'm obsessed with human stories, and this is such a human story. But as we wait for questions to roll in, I have to ask you, Navy to Navy guy, why Coast Guard history? What drew you to that history?
Okay. So in the last half of my service, I tried to join Navy Guard harbor security port security units,
Mhm.
and I was an operations planning officer. And as part of my job being an operations planner, I had to learn and be very familiar with Coast Guard capabilities, where all the stations were, where all the boats were, and stuff. And in getting to know all that, I got to be very, very appreciative of their history and the fact that their story isn't told to the American public as well as that of the Navy or the other branches of the armed forces. So, particularly once I retired from my civilian career, I was determined to offer my services as a volunteer, which I actually do, to the U.S. Coast Guard Historian's Office to help teach Coast Guard history and do volunteer work with various museums on their displays and things like that.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. We have a couple questions coming through. The first question that we got was from Facebook, from Sue. When did they implement the use of the telegraph/radio?
So, interestingly, back in the 1870s, the Army Signal Service set up telegraph stations co-located with the life-saving stations at a number of key sites all over the United States. And they serve two purposes: to report on any shipwrecks that occurred, but also to report weather conditions, as well as if there were any enemies trying to invade the country. So, so it really was probably in the mid 1870s that the Army Signal Service started that, and that was strictly old wire telegraph type communication system. As I said, the telephone system was a very early thing that the life-saving service and then the Coast Guard had for all the stations. Radio really came into use starting in the 1920s. The bigger bases had it starting in World War I in the 19 teens. But as far as the individual smaller stations, that didn't happen until really during the years of Prohibition, the 1920s.
Thank you so much. Our next question was from Michelle, who I've seen commenting on a lot of this this topic. So thank you again, Michelle, for tuning in. But she asks, you touched briefly on Lyle guns. Can you go a bit more into the difference between Lyles and in earlier versions?
Sure. So the Manbi Mortar, which is what we started out with, was a British invention. And basically it was being used over in Great Britain by the Royal National Lifeboat Institution to shoot ropes out to shipwrecks. And so we adopted that here in the United States starting in the 1840s with the Newell Act and the original boathouses that were built. But the problem with the Manbi Mortar was it wasn't particularly accurate, and it was and its reliable maximum range was only around 200 yards. So when the life-saving service comes about in 1871, priorities was to develop a more accurate and longer range capability to shoot the ropes out to the shipwreck. And so they got the loan of David Lyle, then a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Artillery Service, and working with both one of the arsenals up in Massachusetts as well as the Sandy Hook life-saving station, he developed what was a bronze howitzer type of gun, and it was much more accurate. And as I said, with a full 9-ounce black powder charge, could get out to about 800, 900 yards. I mean, that was maximum capability for the gun in terms of the powder charge. Usually in an actual rescue, only to use maybe 3 to 4 ounces of powder, in which case your maximum range was down around 600 yards.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And she continued with, are there any surviving stations, and are any functional or simply historical relics?
Stations or guns?
Stations.
Stations.
Yeah.
There are a couple of Coast Guard stations on each coast that are quote unquote from the standpoint of their station architecture. Mm-hmm. More so here on the East Coast than anywhere else. And again, you have to remember the buildings that were built back in the 1800s were not intended to have creature comforts. So for today's servicemen and women, you need indoor, you need central heating, air conditioning, and so forth. So in vast majority of the cases, those old buildings couldn't be repurposed or redone. Mm-hmm. Exist as an equipment building and so forth, but for the most part, you're talking about much more modern buildings that have all the conveniences that you would expect for the type facilities.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Aaron asks, you may have touched on this, but I'm not sure if I heard correctly. Are there any U.S. LSS life cars on exhibit today? I know of a couple, but I don't know like specifics. Do you have any insight to that, Tim?
Yeah, so there are. There are. Well, as I said, we have one at the Twin Lights in Highland, New Jersey. There's one down in Tuckerton, New Jersey. That was the egg-shaped variety. There's one on display at the Coast Guard Academy Museum. There's one on display at the Michigan Maritime Museum in South Haven, Michigan. There's one out the West Coast, I believe, at the Columbia River Maritime Museum. And I think there are maybe 1 or 2 others up in the Great Lakes someplace, but I believe there are somewhere between 6 and 8 on display. There are more that exist, but a lot of them are either in storage or very, very deteriorated. So as far as actually on display, I want to say there are somewhere between 6 and 8.
Okay. Awesome. Those are all the questions I've gotten through Facebook and through Zoom. I think if you guys have any further questions, I've left my email in the chat. And if you'd like to get in touch or at least ask the question, I can ask through to Tim later on. But thank you so much. I had a blast. I learned a lot. I know we have 2 more coming up scheduled currently. Our next one is slated for the 27th of March, and there we're going to talk about Station Erie. That registration you can find at our website, www.eriemaritimemuseum.org. And then the third one, U.S. Coast Guard operations during the Prohibition, which I'm thoroughly excited about because I think that one's really, really interesting. But likewise, you can find that on our website and through Facebook. Tim, again, thank you so much. Is there anything going on that you? Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I just want to mention for all the attendees that I'm providing Chuck with PDF file copies of my presentations. So if you want a copy of the presentation, Chuck can email that to you. And if you give them an email address, and I mean, none of this is copywritten, so the images I use are in public domain. So, Chuck has my contact information. If any of you have really in-depth questions that you need help with, I'm always happy to help. So.
Yeah. And as we're closing out, Fred says, very nice job, Tim. And Aaron commented, thank you. One of the most interesting things I learned today is how people didn't know how to swim well in the 19th century. Makes sense why so many would need to be rescued by trained crews. Yeah, it's an interesting topic, interesting talking point too. Yes, like I said, I just threw my email down in the chat. Feel free to fire away if you want to actually receive this PDF. Thank you again for tuning in. It's a cold, blustery night in Erie, so there's nothing better than talking history on a night like this. So thank you so much, everybody, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Tim. Have a great night, everyone.